This is a little guide about how to write a very simple PHP class. Nothing too complicated at the moment, so we're not going to cover things like namespaces or anything like that, but I just want to show you the absolute basics of what you do. So a PHP class looks like this. You literally just write class, my class, and the idea is that it's a self-contained object. So it contains functions and contains methods and contains variables that may or may not be able to be accessed outside of this class. So, as a basic example, what you typically have is, as a very simple class, you have public function construct, like this. So what happens here is if you create a class, the constructor automatically gets run. So if I was to put here echo something, then if I create this class, something would be echoed because this function gets run. So you should never ever run any code in the class directly. So you should never do something outside of here or up above here. The class should kind of sit in isolation in its own right. Let me change this to PHP encoding. Okay. So what you would do typically is you'd have your class file, and it's convention to name the file my class. So I'd name this file myclass.class.php, something like that. So let's imagine this is some index file somewhere. If you wanted to create an object of your class, which is something, it's almost like an array. Think of it like an array. You're creating an array, but you can the array can contain functions and not just variables. Think of it that way. So I'll call it inst because it's an instance of the class. So you go new my class. Right? So what this will do is it creates almost like an object in memory, the same way as it would an array, but instead of it being an array, which is essentially a type of class, it creates this. So what it will do when you first load it is it will run that constructor, and what you'll see at this stage is it will output hello world, or sorry, it'll output something here. Great. Now the benefit of using classes is you can use them multiple times. So if I did that, for example, I'd now have two classes, two objects in memory, two completely separate arrays that represent the objects that you could maybe use in different ways. But let me focus on one for a second. So in the same way that you've got echoing something, you can also pass parameters. So if I go $message here, same way you would with a function, like this, then this would output whatever message you input to it. So you could go my message, same way you would a function. So anything that you pass in when you construct your class gets passed to the constructor. Right. So that's how you get things into your class, but what do you actually do with this structure once you've got it set up? Well, a class can have variables. So you've got two types of variables, two main classes of variables. There's actually many more than that, but I'll show you these for now. So you've got private variables. So let's have private variable var. Now a private variable can only be accessed within the class, so you couldn't access it outside of here. And then you've got public variables, public var, like that. Now public variables can be accessed outside of it. So let's imagine we gave both of these values for the time being. So I'm going to call this I'm public, and this one would be I'm private. Right, like so. So before I go into functions within a class, you've got these variables within a class. So what you can do here, you see how this is called public var. I'm going to copy that. If you wanted to echo that variable, you could go $inst public var. Right? Now what that does is because this is a public variable, anyone can access it. So this allows you to get public var, and if anything sets it within this class, any functions within this class, then you can get it out like this. But if you tried to do that with the private one, it would throw a nasty error. So that's the basic concept. Now, sometimes you want to be careful with this, because if you're directly setting variables within a class, you can increase margin for error. So what people will generally do is they'll have what's called getter and setter variables. So you might have public set public var, something like this. So you create a function within this. So one thing I've not covered yet is, so you've got these variables up here. How do you interact with them within the object? If you just did this, so for example, you might have public var here as well. So this starts to get confusing, because you've got public var here and you've got public var here. What the hell's going on? You might think you can go public var equals public var, but that doesn't actually work. So if the way you handle this is with this. So you have this prefix this that goes before it, and that basically says set public var, and this represents this class. So set public var of this class to public var that's posted here. So obviously that looks a little bit confusing, so you might want to get around that if someone's reading your code by never having a parameter that matches the name of a public variable. But that's kind of how that's structured. So you can use, and you can have other functions, public some other function, like so. Oh, I've not put function in front of these. Public function, some other function, and this can access public var as well. And regardless of which functions operate on it, regardless of which functions operate on it, it's like a variable anywhere. It changes and updates in the order of execution. So what you'll typically do is anything that's public and you might need to access elsewhere, you make public. And anything that you think, I'm only ever going to need to use this within this particular class. Let's say you've got a particular function that let's say it's recursive, and you've got one function that calls another function that calls another function, and those other two functions are only there for logical reasons. And really, there's only one function out of those three that anyone's ever going to call in real world terms. What you would do is the same as you make a variable private, you make the function private. So you can go private function, my private function, like so. So now this function can only be called within this object. So I can do this. What I might do is, let's say this returns test, like so, right? In here, you might have echo, same way you would with a variable. You have to use with functions internally. So you might have my private function. So if you called some other function here, which actually let's pretend we're doing it. So same way you reference a variable, you can reference a function. So we go inst, and we're going to call some other function here. Some other function. So because we've instantiated this as an object, we can now use it to call the function within it, and because it's public, we can call it. What we couldn't do, so we couldn't do this. That wouldn't work because that's a private function. So what will happen? This will run this. This then runs this function, and then in this function it would simply return test. Notice in here that you can have functions above and below each other, and the order that you put your functions within the class doesn't actually matter because of the way that it works. So that's good. But typically you'll have a constructor at the top, like so. So that's kind of how you set up public and private functions. Now you can imagine loads of ways that you might use this. But the idea is what you try to do is you try to keep a particular class cohesive, and by that I mean it has its own little task. So you might have a booking class, or you might have a user class, or you might have a logging class. we won't go into model view controller structures right now. That's a topic for another day, but that's kind of roughly how you structure and set them up. Now, there is another type of function, and that is a static function. So if I was to create a public static function, this is getting a little bit more complicated, but it should make sense. So if I create this public static function here, what does this mean? Well, a static function isn't able to edit these variables, right? Because the idea is that this is your normal function. It's almost like it doesn't quite belong in an object. So it also can't access any functions that aren't static functions. So why would you want to use a static function? Well, the benefit of using a static function is you don't need to create the object. So if I wanted to, so we've got the instantiation of the class here. What we could do is run this static function. Now you see this is actually above where we've instantiated the class, yet it will run and work anyway. If a function doesn't need to cross-reference other functions within here and doesn't need to cross-reference the variables, static functions is generally faster. So, for example, let's say I had a login class that had a username at the top here, and I had some function that was doing something with a username. That couldn't be static because it's accessing the variable. But let's say I had some sanitization function on an email address or something, that doesn't need to know anything about the data as long as it just takes a parameter and outputs a result. So you might have that as static. So it's just worth knowing the difference between the two, because you'll come across this if you use any of the objects that we write. You'll come across this static function, but it just means it's not part of the object. So let's look at something else here. So let's imagine that we got a variable in here called public. Let's call it private message, right? And what we'll do is we'll make whatever you pass to the constructor get saved into this variable, like that. And let's have one other function called set message. Oh yeah, I never told you, the reason you tend to have getter and setter variables, you don't always do it, but the reason why you would is because let's say you wanted to do some operation at the point at which you set a message. So let's say you wanted to validate that the message put in was correct. If you're just editing the variable directly, those validation rules aren't built into your process. But if you're requiring a function to do it, they are. So you could automatically make sure that something's an int when it gets submitted. The thing is, you don't know necessarily when you structure and start using the data right away whether you're going to need to do stuff like this. So a good rule of thumb is to just do it anyway from the beginning, and then if you ever want to, even if it's only this to begin with, if you do ever want to then change it and add validation rules in, you can. Like so. But anyway, so what we've done here is we've made it so that when you create the object, like this, I'll keep that there actually, but I'll comment it out. When you create an object like this, what it's doing is passing my message into message. Message is then getting stored into this variable, and you can set and get to the message like this. Right. So the reason I want to show you this, let me cancel that. The reason I want to show you this is because you might have a usage where you want to reuse this class multiple times with different messages. So as an example, we mentioned instance 2. So we go something else. So again, if you think of these like an array, it's just like having two arrays, but the arrays contain functions that do something with this data. So what you will do here, if you went echo instance 2 get message, and then echo instance 1 get message, this would output my message, and this one would output something else. So you might imagine a situation where you've got a load of users, maybe you're doing some operation on 5 users. You might load them into a users object, and then the functions in this do stuff with the data that's in there, and that's kind of how you structure it. Rather than use parameters like this, you may want to always pass arrays to them and treat it in a similar way that you would a JSON array. That's up to you, that's a construct thing. I won't go into too much detail here about those. But that's how you would kind of construct and set and use classes in a basic sense. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we really need to cover in this. Commenting convention is quite an important thing to have when you're writing classes. So at a basic level, if you want to structure your comments like this, roughly. So, where you're describing your parameters, you have @param. So you might go @param message equals, and then you say this is a message, message, and then you might have @return nothing, so for this one you might have @return the message, like so, and then you might have some description about the class. And you can also have the same up here where you're describing the actual class itself. Oh no, sorry, something about the method, like that. Now this is good commenting convention because you don't always need to, if you've got short functions, you don't always need to comment them in here. So it can be a good way of just giving people a little overview about how this all stacks together without them needing to spend ages reading it. There are also some tools that automatically create documentation based upon this comment convention. And there's actually loads of documentation on all different things you can do. Like this, you can do @throws. If you've thrown an exception or something, you can do that. But that's not for this particular message anyway. Yeah, so we've got commenting convention, we've got classes. So I'm going to go a little bit more complicated here. Oh no, actually, yeah, one more thing I want to raise before we go about this. It's good practice to try and keep functions small. So typically you want to keep your function about that big, from that selection to that selection, big enough that it could comfortably fit in your view at once. Now, you can't always do this. Some functions need to be large, but as a rule of thumb, it is much better to split a big function into lots of little ones because it makes it so much easier to debug. And I'd recommend doing that wherever you're programming. This can help. It's not just about debugging, actually. It's about anybody else coming along and understanding your code. It makes it much, much easier. So I want to show you one more thing. Now this is going a little bit more advanced, and I want to show you something that's called inheritance or extension, sorry. So you might have a class again. So let's go. Now this is actually bad practice. You should never include 2 classes within one PHP file, but imagine for the second that they are split. So let's call this parent class, right? Like so. What you can do is you can make your child class, which we'll call my class, extend parent class. Now what does this mean? Well, it means that you can have some variables parent var means you can have some variables that are accessible by the child. So for example, if parent var equals x, you could do this. Which would mean that, because my class extends parent class, it would mean that parent var would be echoed whenever you ran this. But you can also use this for functions. So you might have public get parent var, like so, which does this. So now any class here that extends the parent class has this function as part of it. But let's say that this doesn't do what you want anymore, you could also put that in there, you know, do whatever you want, so like this. And now this has overridden this parent class's function, so you know it's got a slightly different implementation. Now why might you want to use this? So let's imagine for a second that you've got a load of different types of users. So you might have an admin user and a normal user. So all users may need get username, but not all users may need some admin function. So what you might do is you might have a parent class called user and then an admin class that extends this to give it some extra functionality. Now there's also other ways you might use it. So let's say you've got a code base that's very stable and secure and you're introducing new features to it. Rather than rewrite the old code base, you might simply extend it, which will adopt all of its functionality, and then class that as your new version that you'll use from now on for whatever reason. So there's lots of different use cases that you might use it. I want to show you something else actually. I deliberately used a public variable here, but there's also another type called protected. So if I put a private here, parent private. So what you can do, so this public var can be used. So you see we've used it here. But what you couldn't do is you couldn't echo the private variable from up here. Like that. That won't work because this is private, it's only accessible by this class. So this doesn't work. However, what does work is the protected one. So what you could do is you could echo the protected variable. Like that. So a protected variable is only accessible via these classes, and you would not be able to do it here. So you couldn't go inst protected var. I mean, for all intents and purposes, for anything outside the class, protected and private are the same. It only really makes a difference when you've got the inheritance structure that you've got here. There are other things and conventions with classes, such as interfaces and stuff, but that's the basics. And I think that's everything that you would need to know to really get on your feet with using PHP classes. I mean, once you've got this sort of basic knowledge, that kind of gives you everything you would need to know to kind of extend off the base of that and learn anything else. But most of the time, you know, if you see what someone's written, the conventions being used are the ones that I've kind of showed you in this video. So I hope that helps. You know, that's a very good guide on how to use it, and maybe I'll zip these two files up so you can have a look at the syntax and compare against it when you're writing your own. Now notice how I've not run any of this code at the moment, so it may contain a bug or two, but I'll leave you to explore what those may be. So I hope that's been useful.